Hi, everyone. I'm Cody Root. This is the Church of Logic, and today it is my extreme pleasure to be talking to Rustan Leino, who's in Seattle right now. Is that right?
Yep.
Rustan is, I think, most well known for his contributions to his significant contributions to Dafny and Boogie, which are two languages, used to reason about programs. And we're going to talk about this. Is there anything else you want to say about you that I have missed?
No, that sounds
Great.
good. Yeah.
Rustin is a polymath musician and all sorts of stuff. Maybe that'll come up, but maybe it won't. And so, yeah, and he's a very interesting person to talk to. So I'm very excited to have him on the show.
Great. I'm really delighted to be here, Cody. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Yeah, so as we briefly discussed before we started, we're going to talk about many things. We might go into some technical specifics, which are interesting to me about, what it means to be a predicate. Over we'll talk about it more later,
Mhm.
but maybe we can start with generalities about what's exciting about logic and what what you feel like your goal is when you're doing this work, like what are the things you hope to accomplish.
Right. Other than just, being an interesting subject, of course. So, some of the backdrop there is, I think at some point, early point, I took a class as an undergraduate in verifying programs. And it was just a required undergraduate course, and I was at UT Austin, and I loved the class. And we did proofs, we did sort of things like Hoare logic, we did preconditions, we had started with predicate logic, and
That's
I
that's
I
remarkable.
think right, yeah, right. I think I was the only one liking the class. I don't know, maybe it's you,
Do
but
you
but
remember
I
who taught the class?
yes,
Was it
absolutely, absolutely. It was Wim Feyen. So Wim Feyen was uh, one of um, one of Dijkstra's colleagues who was visiting from the Netherlands for a year, and I was lucky enough to be there. That overlapped with my undergraduate education, and so yeah, he has a particular style, and I was influenced by many things there. But of course, you go on. So the calculational format of sort of giving him, you write something, a line, then you say this is equal to something else, and then you give a hint to explain each step. That's sort of a common format, but the particular format that's used there is sometimes attributed to Wim Feyen. And
oh
in the Dafny language has such a calc statement, a calculational logic, and I think it's a quite a useful sort of
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've definitely used that.
yeah. Several
Let's
other
see.
tools.
For
Yeah.
people who don't know Daphne, I'm trying to explain. Let's see. How would one say this? Basically, you want to capture what mathematicians do when they have a long line of, equalities,
Hmm.
where each line, follows from the next via some kind of elementary reasoning step.
Hmm.
Um, but in math papers, I guess, you either write these equalities and just expect the reader to say, I can understand why, these things are equal. But usually there's a reason, right? There's some cleverness at each line or very little
Hmm.
cleverness, but it's easy for, a less sophisticated reader or someone who's not quite as in the subject to get
Hmm.
lost. And so there you say, okay, here's where I'm being clever. This one should be obvious. This one, falls from the previous one. And maybe that whole big step was hard, but because I broke it down, it's not that hard. This is the induction hypothesis or something. So
Hmm.
mathematicians do this all the time like crazy. And yeah, in program proofs, you want to do this as well. You want to explain to the machine why all these steps hold, and you really want to break it down into roughly atomic chunks.
Indeed, right. Yep. Yep. So that was a big part. A number of languages. I think F star, Liquid, Haskell, Lean, whatever have also, I mean, mimicked Daphne's calc statement. And actually, there was a variation of it before then in Agda, but Daphne elaborates it in a different way. But anyhow, so
Okay.
yes, so as an undergraduate, I learned that sort of calculational style of proofs um, but more to the point, I got hooked on the idea that oh, you can actually verify a program, and then I worked as a software developer before I went back to grad school, and I when I look back at that, I mean some memories or things that I've saved from then. I mean, it was I guess clear that I had that in mind, and so then I started.
I,
Well,
can
yeah.
I push on that? Like,
Yeah.
what do you can you explain just because of the style in which you wrote the programs, or
No, what I'm thinking more is, um, for example, I was at Microsoft as a developer in the 89 through 91, and our group, I was in the LAN manager group, the user interface, network user interfaces, and we did a group T-shirt as one does, and the group T-shirt then looked like one of the dialog boxes that we were doing. Of course, I mean, think 19 late
yeah.
80s dialog box, whatever. So it had each of our names and our like login name, and then a comment. So and my comment was, I can prove that. Which, when I look back at it, I mean, yeah, I mean, how I guess I was into that at that point. But and when I interviewed with Microsoft at that point, I one of the interviews, I mean, proved the program that I was asked to write,
Oh,
and
wow.
that was I mean,
Yeah, that wasn't
yeah,
really in the
no,
air of the time,
it
maybe.
was
I
not. Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I think Cock, which is now called Rock, I mean, th that must have existed by then. Just
Yeah, right. I guess it would have been right around that time, but I think it wasn't really done in quite that way, maybe. But yeah, certainly no. I guess when I started grad school, 91, I mean, HOL was around. I'd used that, and but it felt different. But another thing that we did also in that group as when I was a developer was that we were using C++, which felt very new at that time. C++ was still translated to C, and then we were to debug the programs. You went through the kernel debuggers. You plug a serial, I mean, you plug something into the serial port of the machine, and you have this like CRT monitor on the
wow.
side, and you see all you could it would disassemble it for you, but that's all. But I mean, you learn to see the C++ inside the
Yeah, wow. I guess I don't really know about that.
right, yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, you're using C++,
Right. And
which
then our group, I mean, we were very disciplined about putting assertions in the code, runtime checkable assertions. So as one does, well, I guess in most programming languages, but the And uh, and I would call this parameter validation. That is, at that time, I mean, you check that pointers are not null. You check that maybe some integers are within ranges and things like that. And this was just really effective. I mean, it's such a simple thing, and so
yes,
our
it's
group.
still right. We still haven't really internalized that as a day-to-day programming practice.
Indeed. And I think it's a great practice. I mean, that's just what we do. I mean, we have some expectation and we write it down in some form. I mean, actually, even if it's in a comment, that would be helpful. But if it's runtime checkable, I mean, you get something back for your efforts of writing it down.
Yeah,
Um, so
yeah, yeah.
this caused a lot of errors, and so our group's bug count, I mean, against us was like far smaller than the other groups, and maybe there were many other subjects. I mean, many other things going
Yeah,
into it, but
factors.
it was noticeable. So when I started grad school, then it seemed like, well, wow, think about, I mean, what if you could check those runtime assertions statically, and well, I guess I knew how to do it in well, I knew how to do it for small academic programs on paper, but so as I did two internships at the DEC Systems Research Center, DEC SRC or CERC, it was called,
Where is that?
So that's it was in Palo Alto. So this was the it was a lab started by Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor had been the director of the famous Xerox PARC lab in the 70s and early 80s that invented so many things of the things we're doing now. And when he was fired from there, he started up this lab at DEC, and DEC had well around that time it had four different labs, three of them, no five, I guess, three in Palo Alto, one in Massachusetts, and one in Paris.
Hmm.
So I worked at the Systems Research Center, SRC.
I guess I'm embarrassed to not have heard of this, but
Oh, okay.
four
Right.
different labs. Okay. Well,
Yep.
okay, cool. So okay, so you work there.
Yep. And So, so Greg Nelson was there. So, I mean, who became a, I mean, good colleague and close friend, and I mean, he has since passed. But he, I mean, so Greg is who he wrote his PhD thesis on cooperating decision procedures, which is like the core of SMT solvers today. And SMT solvers, as we know, I mean, they're all over.
Great.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so that was, I mean, the core contribution there. And moreover, actually, he also he sketched in his last chapter something about how to handle quantifiers in um, such a tool, which is
Oh yeah.
also something picked up later. But maybe we'll
I
get
should
into
read
that
those
later.
papers.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's a lovely thesis. I mean, PhD theses are yeah, not the easiest to or the most memorable maybe, but his is really nice.
Yeah, I guess I kind of disagree. It in terms of length, PhDs tends to be very heavy, right? There are hundreds of pages versus, just a few pages for articles.
Hmm.
But but the fact that they don't need to be condensed, the fact
Hmm.
that they are allowed to meander a little bit or spend a lot of time on the introduction, I
Hmm.
find it's sometimes useful to go for go for the PhD because there you get not only do you get a lot of space, but I also feel the lack of having to go through, a traditional,
Hmm.
paper reviewing process gives you a little bit more freedom to tell the secrets. I always want papers to tell me the secrets.
Hmm.
Like I understand that there are mathematical results, and there's a table maybe of experiments but I don't want that. I want what you would tell me in a conversation
Hmm.
if I was just starting to work with you, right? And those are the things the real secrets. Like why is it annoying? Why is it cool? Why is it weird? What are the metaphors that you use to think
Hmm.
about these things? And
I,
those
I,
appear sometimes in PhDs.
right. I agree. Having that space to, I mean, to write what you actually want to say, I mean, is really great. Actually, this reminds me, if I may take just a tangent, I just think it's such a funny story, funny to me.
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
I usually give when I talk to students who are either thinking about doing a PhD or they're in their PhD, I I tell them that I mean there's usually what happens is you're doing your PhD and you think you have this idea in your head that your PhD thesis is going to be this greatest thing and it's going to be studied for
Yeah,
centuries.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
mean, it's going to be like the ultimate kind of thing, um, which I mean, never is.
Yeah.
And that's not really the point. The point of the PhD is to learn how to do research. I mean, and things, and you have to prove that by writing something, and then your thesis is one of the things that you write. But and maybe if you did have the final word on things and it was the ultimate thing, maybe it wasn't such an interesting subject. I don't know, but
I agree. There are a few kind of notorious theses, at least in mathematics, where it
Mhm,
feels like, yes, an exceptional an exceptionally productive person came up
mhm,
with an exceptional insight, and they happened to do it, during their PhD.
mhm,
And so, okay, so, they wrote a few pages and it was, astronomically influential.
mhm.
But that is just never like that's one in a million, right? I
Right.
mean,
That's right. It's not what at least if you expect that. when you're doing your PhD, you would never finish writing your thesis just because it's going to be, I mean, too high of a bar.
Yeah.
So one of the times when I was giving this advice to a student about, I would say about 5 years ago, maybe it was on this side of the pandemic, and we're at some coffee shop in Seattle. And then and I give that advice. I said, like, no one is ever going to read your PhD thesis, essentially, right? And the very next morning, I have an email from Leslie Lamport, I mean, Turing Award winner, saying, in chapter 10 of your and, so apparently he was
Yeah, that's flattering.
yeah, right. Yeah. He
But
wanted to, I mean, just to be clear, he wanted to criticize that part of my thesis, not hold it up, but still, I mean,
yeah, I
that's
have
such
to
a funny
say,
thing. Yeah.
um, my understanding of Leslie Lamport, and I hope he never sees this podcast, is that criticism comes more easily to him than praise. So, so maybe that's the best you could expect.
Well, right. Yeah. He's seen a lot of things. Okay. So rolling back, where was I be? So I had this idea. I mean, so I did two internships this is now in the early 90s. I did two internships and the second of those at the Dex Systems Research Center, or SRC. CERC is whatever one call it, CERC. So at CERC, I worked with Greg Nelson, and he had just started this extended static checking project. And the language at that point that was being used was Modula 3. And that's sort of, I mean, work that went into that also then went into my PhD thesis, and then um, um, well, moving on from there, I mean, that turned into ESE Java later on, which we were really trying to do this for programs, and then worked on Spec Sharp, and then that you take the things apart, I mean, we turned it into Boogie and then Dafny and things. We can talk more about some details there, but I think that the beginning there was really that with extended static checking, the idea was, well, you use program logics and you use, I mean, well, weakest preconditions and I mean, or logic, however you want to think of it. But the goal with extended static checking, I mean, back then, was to lower the ambitions. That is to say, we're not going to prove the program correct. What we're going to do is we're going to prove the absence of certain runtime errors. And so that's really just what we were doing at Microsoft with those assertions. I mean,
Yeah,
like parameter validation. And so, of course, when you get into it, you realize, I mean, fairly quickly that, I mean, you can't just, those assertions are easy to check, but to check them, you need to have lots of invariants about data structures and all sorts of things.
yeah, yeah.
So,
I mean, at the end of the day, right?
mhm,
In C or C++, right,
mhm,
it's obvious that um, even relatively simple assertions like not being null is of
mhm,
course undecidable, right? Because everything can, yeah, like everything is undecidable,
mhm.
and in particular, sometimes you could definitely accidentally encode this pointer is not null as meaning a lot of very complicated things have happened.
Right. And I think that the way out of that is that the reason I think that the halting problem does not sort of stop our progress there is that the human has some idea, or maybe I should say the program author, maybe it's an AI these days, but
Yeah, sure.
the author of the program has some idea of why this is going to work. So if you can get that explanation in some sort of way, then you can hope to complete the proof. So,
That
so so even though I mean, if we got the program without any other kind of proof hints, we'd be in a very difficult situation. It seems hopeful if the programmer helps.
Yeah, I've often had that thought, but I guess nowadays sometimes I wonder, right?
Mhm,
Because now that I've written a few, moderately large programs, I do know that when I write it, I have an idea of
mhm,
why these things should go well, but of course that idea is a little bit flimsy, and
mhm,
of course sometimes it's flawed, right? Sometimes concrete things I think about the program are just not true. But
mhm.
that's true about all of mathematical thought, right? I mean,
Right. Yep. Many things we think might be true are not.
right,
So
right.
yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, so there is a balance to be
Hmm.
had, right? If we could only get the human to explain what they meant,
Hmm.
then that would help a great deal. But also, humans make terrible mistakes, and often mistakes that they think are like, how could I be so stupid, right? Like,
Right. And even if they're right, I mean, there are just so many little cases to go through, and so I mean, to try to do that well by hand, it's just yeah, not what we want. I mean, help from machines in
right,
this. But I think that just that idea that is of having an extended side checker and building that kind of technology, and at that point it was the rival. I mean, we knew that sort of the competition, if you will, at that point was testing. Well, it still is testing, by the way.
yeah,
But so it didn't have to be sound. I mean, it didn't have to prove everything if it could do more than testing, and that's why it. I mean, Greg named it extended static checking
I see.
and uh, and we were willing to have unsoundnesses. And also when we did the ESC Java project afterwards, the which was I mean Cormac Flanagan and Remy Stata and Mark Littlebridge, James Sachs, of course, and me and Greg as well. The I mean, there we tried to then we were essentially saying, okay, we did something for module three, and let's try to do this at a larger scale. Let's do it for a language that's popular, and Java was just sort of coming into being and into popularity. So seemed like a good choice. So we made a number of choices there to make it unsound. So this was, I mean, back then to so for example an object invariant. I mean, you have an object and you have some sort of steady state of the data structure. Maybe your object points to two other objects and they have some fields and they are in agreement in some way. Maybe one is the
Yeah,
length of the other's array or
sure.
something. And but then to check that and to keep track of all of those pointers, and there was something that had the name rep exposure at that time, which essentially means that you take one of your internal pointers and you somehow uh, give it out to the outside, and the outside can now modify it. And um, I mean, so so we didn't have solutions to those things, and we also thought that this would, even if we did, maybe it would be too much effort for someone to actually go through it. So that's why ESC Java was unsound by design. But we were very careful in the reference manual to write down all the places that where it was unsound to say, here's where it's not going to check these things, it's going to check these things for you.
I see, I see, I see.
And
Yeah, I
this was under a lot of debate actually at the time and received a lot of criticism. So I was actually, I mean, ecstatic when well, the whole team 10 years after the PLDI publication of it got the like the 10-year most influential paper award because things had changed in those years. So that 10-year span, the paper came out, I think, 2002. So in the early 2000s, I think people started changing their minds about um, well, both what such program tools could do, program logics, and actually there was development in program logics, and but also the idea that it could be okay actually in some cases to be unsound if you document it and you know and you're clear about that purpose. You don't say,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah. Because I mean, well, I don't know. I don't know if I really want to take the argument side of unsoundness,
yeah,
but I do believe that as you said, your competition is just tests, right? It's
mhm,
just humans staring at code and humans running dynamic tests. And so yeah, though
yeah,
both of those things are very unsound, and yet they're the industry standards.
yeah,
And then B, yeah, keeping track as human beings of these invariants is a full-time job, and it's also something that they do, right?
mhm,
Like mostly they just write in comments that thou shalt never, pass in a null here,
mhm,
or you shouldn't alias these things if you want them to run concurrently.
mhm.
And so,
Yeah, I
okay, I
think.
mean,
Mhm. Yeah,
just
these are, I mean, it's right, indeed. So comparing it to testing and trying to do more is great. But actually, just to be clear, I also no longer think that one should go for for unsound tools. Well, actually, no, that's not right. It depends if you're doing a bug checking tool, then you know it's unsound. And I mean, I think then you should go for unsoundness and just document where it is. But if you're really doing a program logic and you're trying to verify a program to be correct, then aiming for soundness, I think is a much better idea. And that's something that we can now do. I think that it was I mean, in the first years of this millennium, it became clear, I think that, I mean, by several people, that, I mean, we could take that same kind of technology that we had used for ESE Java and the extended checker for Module 3 well, I mean, that was program verification technology. We could actually take that and use automatic or automated tools to apply that in sound situations. I think that the person who, for me, I think, kind of, I mean, opened up my eyes to that was Bart Jacobs. There are two Bart Jacobs in our field. One is Dutch, the other one is Belgian. I'm referring to the Belgian one.
Oh, wow. Okay. I did not know that, and I was confused for a minute.
And I've co-authored with both of them, which is
Oh, well,
confusing
that's
as
kind of
well.
cool.
Yeah. And yeah, so I'm talking about the Belgian Bart Jacobs, who is at Leuven and has done well, a number of things, but I guess in the last many years he's done the very fast tool, which is verifier for both Java and C programs. And uh, I mean, so he was pushing that front, and
I see.
I'm sure surely there were others as well, but somehow in my mind, I think that opened up my mind to that that one could, I mean, go further with the automated technology that we had. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I started academia right about the time people were like, SMT solvers are gonna, change the world.
mhm.
And so, yeah, so I mean, there's
Yeah,
definitely a shift in attitudes.
right. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm really enjoying the story. Do you want to keep it going
No,
until?
actually, I think that was all to explain. I mean, how did I get into program logic and so forth? And I think that, I mean, that sort of sets the stage. So,
Okay, 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 okay. Um, okay, so yeah, man, so many things we could talk about, I guess. So all right. So then Boogie and Daphne, which I feel like deserve their own entire episodes.
mhm.
Um uh, I don't know. Like, yeah, what should we talk about next?
Excellent. So, okay, let me propose just, well, one comment there. I mean, also about what you said about the PhD thesis in and how we learn things. As I was saying these things, I remembered something there which also says something about Boogie later. So when um, well, when I was working on these things, I was probably still a graduate student, or could have been. No, I probably still a graduate student. I was thinking about, well, a Hoare logic has like and we were just looking at sequential programs. No, that's not true, but well, I was at the time. So you have a precondition and a postcondition. But then I'm thinking, well, you want to check some conditions in between. Like, for example, you have a in between, you have an array index operation, so you want to check that it's in bounds. So I wanted to somehow have some kind of Hoare triple or quadruple, something, I don't know, that would say that you go from the pre-state to the post-state in a particular way, and then I wanted to put some conditions or things in between there. And I mean, this is, I mean, looking back at it, I mean, it's a naive way of thinking of it. I mean, that just meant that I didn't fully understand how to represent these problems at that time. And what I learned, well, shortly thereafter, I guess, is that, well, if you then put an assertion into that program, that plays the effect of proving that, even if you just consider the whole Hoare triple or the whole, take the weakest precondition of the whole
Yeah,
thing.
because it bubbles up, right?
Exactly, it bubbles up, right? And that's something I didn't have clear in my mind. I mean, in many ways I ought to have, but it wasn't. So I think when I I mean, so in Boogie, for example, so Boogie is then an intermediate verification language, and it's intended for if you're building your own verifier for something, then I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure you'd like to make use of, and if you can represent your programs in terms of something intermediate that knows how to, for example, check assertions, then that's good. And that's really exactly what Boogie does. I mean, Boogie lets you write program-like things. It looks like a program. It's just not the sort of thing that you would compile and run. And it has assertions in it, and those assertions are what's going to be checked. So that's something that I learned along the way that um, well just shows well both my how green I was at the time, and also that I mean we do progress in various ways, and so I think so someone who builds on top of Boogie to build a program verifier um, doesn't have to understand those things. They just need to understand, oh, put an assertion here, and that
Right, right, right.
takes care
Yeah.
of the rest.
Yeah. I mean, oh man. Maybe I should have prepared better for this. There are so many things I want to say. One
Mhm,
is that you did say Boogie is an intermediate language, but it's
mhm,
not something you necessarily want to run.
mhm,
And I've often thought about this. Why not?
uh-huh,
Like I have my own ideas. Yeah, there are things that are hard to run because they don't, yeah, they're quantifications, right? Like
mhm.
what's the operational semantics of a quantifier?
Right.
Um, but but at the same time,
Mhm,
we're doing computer science. All of
mhm,
these things are kind of operational in some sense, maybe. I
mhm,
don't know. I have this French I don't want to say perversion, but bent maybe of wanting to think about um, the relationship between logic and programming is like a very intimate, very
mhm,
yeah. Logic has an operational content,
mhm.
um, but that's kind of beside the point. My point is, should Boogie actually be an IR that has an operational semantics?
Right. So of course it does have an operational semantics, but if it's realistic to execute or not is a bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
That's a
yeah.
good point.
So okay. Actually, this is an interesting point, and it's also something that, as it turns out, we're discussing sort of at the office in my day job. Um, th- right now, and
Which I don't think is a secret, is AWS.
is AWS. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Right. And so there are a couple of things. Um, well, first of all, there have been execution engines, or um, I guess more symbolic, but one is called Symboglix, and the other one is called Boogaloo. Actually, were there more in well, those are the two that come to mind. So people have tried to sort of well execute Boogie programs in some way, but but there are two things that are dicey there. One thing is that when you encode into something like Boogie, or at least at some point when you're going to encode something for formulas down below, um, you're going to choose mathematical data structures for some things. And for example, memory is going to look like something. Or maybe if it's an object-oriented program, maybe you would have a heap with heap allocated objects. Maybe if it's something like Java with regions or Rust or something, maybe you represent it in different ways. Maybe you have many different heaps and so forth. And at some point, you're going to have to model those mathematically. Um, and one way to do it is to think of it as just a big map, big function or big lookup table or a whatever you want to call it, association sort of a key value kind of thing where for every address you associate some object, let's say, or maybe some integer if you're doing a C program. Um, Now, if you're doing it that way, that may not be the best way to execute a program, because when you're gonna if you update that heap, you're gonna get a new mathematical object that is a new heap that's gonna be very much like the old one, except that you've changed the memory in one place. And so unless you have restrictions
Yes,
on
yes, yes, yes.
on
Okay, I
that,
see.
now you're going to have to at runtime have two of those because who knows
I
if they
see, I see.
have
Okay,
one.
okay, okay, okay. So let's see. So the low level summary is
Mhm,
um in operational semantics,
mhm,
as you go to lower levels, you want things to be extremely mutable because that's how machines work.
mhm.
But in mathematics, nothing is mutable. Everything is, in the Platonic realm of ideas. And so those two things are in extreme tension.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so
and then I guess
that's a nice way to phrase it. Yeah, right. Yeah.
and then the higher level lesson perhaps is it's not a great idea to want to do two things at the same time, which is A, have an operational semantics that's reasonable and fast and usable, and then
Mhm.
also on the other side have a good program, have a good logical interpretation of your programs that's reasonable to run verifiers on and
Mhm.
that's expressive enough to talk about the things you want to talk about.
Right. Yep. So I think that's one key point in this. There's another one that is also has an interesting sort of backdrop, and that is the a language like Boogie has, in addition to assert statements, it has assume statements. So an assume statement says, uh, when you get to that point in the program, just assume blindly that this condition holds. And that is, it's not your responsibility if it doesn't hold. And and it turns out when you encode programs like source programs into something like Boogie, those assume statements are used everywhere. They're just very useful. So, but then the question is, well, if you then assume things, shouldn't, I mean, how do you justify those? Well, there are different ways that you could justify them, and it would be interesting, I think, to make one way that you could try to make to prove the soundness of a program logic. Actually, maybe I'll get back to that. But um, but first, the assume statement itself is something that when Dijkstra considered in the 1970s some healthiness conditions. So he wrote a book, the famous Discipline in Programming, and which essentially introduced weakest preconditions and so forth. I guess it had appeared in some paper form before, but um, and so he had five healthiness conditions that he said any programming language that is worth considering has these five properties. And it's interesting, today, really only one of them survives, which is monotonicity, which is essentially means monotonicity of the weakest preconditions. But I mean, not steer in that way. But one that is famous of out of those five is the one that was called the law of the excluded miracle. So not the excluded middle, but the law of the excluded miracle. And essentially, I mean, really what it's saying is that you should not have assume statements. And why is that? Well, because an assume statement is not executable. When you get there, if you at runtime, if you got to an assume statement, if the condition holds, great. I mean, you just continue executing. But if
Yeah,
it
it's a
doesn't
no-op.
hold, right? If it doesn't hold, then what? I mean, it's and and people give sort of different sort of ways of thinking of this that, well, if you get there, then and it's then you win. I mean, that is, you if you think of program execution as some sort of tension between a demon and an angel and so forth. At this point, the demon loses. The demon has no choice. I mean, made a bad choice somewhere, and so you win. Well, that's great in mathematics, but it's what are you going to do at runtime? You're in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
data center, and then you get there. Now
Yeah,
what?
because crashing at that point would just be an assert, right? Like,
Exactly. Crashing would be an assert, so a behavior that you don't want. But an assume that fails is actually the best kind of behavior mathematically. It's
yeah.
um, and so, but there are, I mean, so if you look at programs that translate into Boogie, Boogie has so many assumes everywhere. So one might then ask, well, why is that? So coming back to program logic, suppose that we want to describe the logic of a programming language, Java perhaps, or C Sharp, or Dafny, or whatever, some
Hmm.
programming language.
Sure.
And then, I mean, in academic circles, when you read a paper, what we tend to see is we tend to see these inference. rules, right? That they have a line, they have some sort of judgment underneath the line that says this is what you can conclude, and then if all of the things on top of the line hold. And uh, and these things, if you look at papers, they tend to have a lot of subscripts, there are a lot of terms, and you have to really read into it, and then at some point you say, okay, that is my, I don't know, operational semantics or whatever kind of semantics you're defining for the programming
Hmm.
language.
Yeah.
Um, but this is the most popular way of doing it, but it's not the only way. You can also define the semantics in terms of something else. I mean, for example, if you define the semantics of, say, Java in terms of logic, I mean, ands and ors and predicates, then you could use this kind of rule. But there's still it's understood that the ands and ors that appear there, they're come from the logic. You're supposed to understand that going into it. In a similar way, if you translate, let's say, Java into a more primitive language, maybe maybe it's bytecode, maybe it's Boogie, maybe it's LLVM. I mean, some other kind of language that you're translating to. If if you know the target language in your head, just like we know logic when we look at these inference rules, then we can understand that translation. We can say, oh, the Java statement, when it makes a call, it first evaluates all of the arguments. So you put them into some variables in the
I see, I
intermediate
see.
language.
So you're saying that somehow, even academic papers are relying on some shared meta theory,
Yeah,
and that the semantics of that shared meta theory, even if it's pure mathematical logic, has some operational semantics in some sense.
right.
Um, and we're relying on that operational
We're relying on it.
semantics.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the reader, whoever inspects this, is expected to understand that common knowledge. And of course, it's at a low level, and I don't think anyone would argue that it's too much of a stretch for someone to have to learn logic before they look at such a thing. But still, there is something there. So you could, but it's a big leap. If you now have to go from Java into such a logic, man, that's a big step. So if you could instead say, well, okay, I know some programming language. I know Boogie, for example, or I know Pascal, maybe you would have said if you're my age or something. You know some of the language. And so if someone could explain, in this case, let's say Java, in terms of that other language, I would be equally happy.
Yeah,
Um,
like a transpiler of sorts.
that's right. It's a transpiler, exactly. So if you now build a verifier for, let's say, Java, and you use Boogie as the intermediate form, that means that you're gonna translate the Java constructs into Boogie constructs. So now what does it mean to prove soundness? Well, of course, we hope that the Boogie tool is sound downwards, but that's someone else's problem now if we're the ones doing the front end from Java into
Right.
Boogie. But we we're going to have to. I mean, if I write this, and you look at my verifier, I'd have to convince you that, let's say, the call statement or the assignment statement, whatever, the way that I have encoded it is the right way. I mean, that is, at some point, humans need to agree that this is Java or this is whatever source language it is. And that you can agree with that with these inference rules, or you can agree with it with some sort of transpilation in some way. And if we could raise that level of the intermediate so that that's also part of the common knowledge, then we could have an easier time doing the translations. Um, so
Okay.
if we do this, if you look at the way that this has been done, I mean, we did it for then SpecSharp, which was the first tool to use Boogie. SpecSharp was a superset of C# with added pre and post conditions and things, or the way we do it in Dafny, or the way that many other tools do it. If you have that translation, it would be wonderful if we could just look at each of those rules and just see the transpilation step and say, yes, that is our semantics. Then we don't have to write the inference rules for the same things. It's just that transpilation. So so there's something that you have to trust to say, yes, this is what it is. I mean, this is the correct definition of Java. But I would argue that that such a translation is a lovely way to, I mean, to describe that source language.
Sure.
But,
Let's
mm,
see. I feel like you're making a point about these
yes,
assumes, and I'm
that's
not
right.
sure
So,
I got that point.
okay, no, I didn't yet. So thank you. Okay. So the point about the assumes is that now when you do that translation, you're going to introduce a lot of assumes. Well, actually, you're going to, I say, maybe you're not going to. Program verifiers today have introduced a lot of assumes in there, and most of them are for um, performance reasons because you want the automatic tool to be fast. But some of them are, for example, on entry to a procedure, if let's say that you have one of the arguments is a 32-bit integer. Well, then you probably want to assume that that is a 32-bit integer because after all, the type system is going to have checked that for you. It's not
I
going to
see,
be
I see, I
a
see.
Boolean
Okay.
or a pointer or whatever.
Right, right. Okay. So you're
So,
saying because Java is constrained by its operational semantics
mhm,
and, it's it's static semantics, it's type checker, and perhaps other things.
mhm,
Maybe even compilation details.
mhm,
You can encode these things that you know to be true that are perhaps extremely difficult to encode or even impossible to encode and check
mhm,
in Boogie. Those do become assumes, which
right.
are basically I know something about the language that I'm communicating to you.
Mhm,
And those can only be violated, if this language is incorrectly
right. That's right.
compiled or
Right.
doesn't
And
have.
actually, in your list of reasons for doing it, one might also say maybe it's just redundant in some way. That is, the type checker has already checked it, for example. But there are many reasons that these assumes are used, and they're convenient in that way. So one way that you can now prove the soundness of a verifier is if I show you my translation and it contains some assumes, you might look at my translation and say, okay, this looks good if you can really assume these things. Well, those things are not things we want to prove with every time that we verify the program, but we'd like to prove them at some point.
I see, like once and for all,
Right.
for the
So
Java translator.
exactly. Either once and for all for the whole tool that anytime that it introduces an assume that it's known to be something that actually does hold as for some other meta reasons. Or maybe this could be done in the way that it's only validated. So here I'm using the technical term validated, I suppose that meaning that it's the particular program that you looked at, it does hold for it, but
I
maybe if
see.
you have a different program tomorrow, it won't. So
Right,
with
right.
that
Let's
kind of
say a
thing,
Rust program without any unsafes or something.
and actually, I'm even thinking the Rust program right in front of you.
Yeah,
So, for
yeah, yeah.
example, so if you work with the automated tool, you want the automated tool to be really fast and stuff, and so because your time is on the line. So when you leave the terminal at the end of the day, uh, at that point, maybe the tool you used wasn't quite sound. Maybe the tool actually introduced behind your back assumptions that weren't really justifiable. So now one could imagine that now we use all of the CPU on the planet overnight while you're asleep or going out for a nice dinner, and it's going to now check and validate that at least for that run of the verifier, all of those assumes
I
were
see.
actually justified. Um,
Okay, so you sort of want
so.
to say, let's see, I guess you want to hedge your bets. You want to say, uh, right now I'm going to assume that catastrophic things
Mhm,
don't happen in this verification.
right.
Um, which is, bugs in the translation or
Mhm,
some strange. But I do want to assume that the immediate consequences of the specific program are true,
mhm,
assuming the catastrophic things don't happen. And I want that to be fast because basically that's the smallest, the place where I make the most mistakes, right,
right.
is this program, right? The
Indeed.
compiler usually doesn't make mistakes, and then
Mhm,
the language designers usually think carefully about these things. And
mhm.
and so now that catastrophic thing, I want to check more slowly, less often.
That's right. And those things are on your plate. I mean, so if the language designer or verification author makes a mistake, um, I mean, that's not something that you would want to think about when you're thinking about your algorithm or data
I see,
structure
I
that
see.
you're trying to prove. So,
Yeah, so you want it to sort of be pushed off to their kind of
Right.
responsibility.
Yeah. So those were two reasons then, as I mentioned, that I mean that there are in an intermediate representation like boogie that first of all you might choose um, mathematical encodings that are not as suitable for execution, and the other one is that you run into the law of the excluded miracle. But why? Well, it's because there are good reasons to have these assumptions. We would like to have them, but that still could mean that there could be some way to really justify them. And if we could justify, if we knew that all of the assumptions were justified, maybe we could still execute these programs or figure out, I mean, how to do it.
I see, I see. This feels a little bit like non-determinism in some way, right? I
Yeah.
feel like a
So one way that non-determinism is used in together with assumes is that you can think of the assume statement as helping tame the non-determinism to make it less non-deterministic. But the sort of the classic example is you non-deterministically you that is arbitrarily you go here or you go here, left or right. And if you go left, you're going to assume that the particular condition P
I
holds.
see.
And if you go the other way, you're going to assume that not P holds. Well, in the sort of the semantics, the if you execute forward, when you get to that non-deterministic choice, you're allowed to choose either one. If you think of this as like a daemon sort of executing a program, the daemon is free to choose either one. But of course, if P holds, and at that point, and the daemon chooses to go to the branch where you assume not P, then the daemon is going to lose. So
Yeah, I
that's not
see.
good.
I see. That's
So
okay. I wasn't sure I understood this demon point of view, but now
mhm.
I do understand. So the demon is constrained by the assumes,
Right.
and the demon is trying to violate asserts.
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
the
Right.
demon winning condition.
Yeah.
I see. So
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 if the assumes are close enough to the non-deterministic choices, then the daemon can just peer to the other, I mean, look at the other side and determine which way to go without sort of being without the fear of falling into an assume trap kind of.
I see.
Right. This, by the way, since I'm plugging various things anyhow, this thing about assert and assume. Well, first of all, in as I said, Dijkstra had argued against assumes, but then in the 1980s I mean like four people who were pushing this in different ways. Um, One was Ralph Buck, who I'll say more about, and one was Greg Nelson, who wrote a wonderful paper about the generalization of Dijkstra's calculus. One was Carol Morgan, who has done lots of things with specification statements, and he's now working on probability and lots of things. He was also arguing for these things. He called them coercions instead of assumes. And the fourth person was Joe Morris, who was working on these sorts of things at that time. And so that sort of turned things around. But then what Ralph Buck did was he and his colleague Joachim von Richt wrote a beautiful book. It's a big, long book, but it's beautiful in building program logics up from lattice theory. And in the first chapter of that book, um, they sort of go through some informal notions of this, that you have many agents and you have like a daemon and an angel, and maybe you have other agents as well. And it's really nice.
Sorry, is this a paper?
No,
That's a book.
well, there were many papers. I'm referring to the book, which is it called maybe just refinement calculus, maybe? I think the book would have come out sometime in the 90s, mid
I'll
90s.
I'll try to remember to bug you about this later, and then
Okay,
I'll put it in
right, yeah.
the
Right. And
cool,
there
cool,
too, by the
cool.
way, in my sort of academic upbringing, I just was very lucky that my first year of grad school, Ralph Buck happened to be visiting at Caltech where I was doing my PhD. So I learned, I mean, those sorts of things and lattice theory, and I learned lots of things from Ralph in that way as well. Um,
Yeah, that is kind of fascinating. I lattice theory is mathematically exciting, I
mhm.
guess.
Yeah.
I'll have to talk about it at some later point. I was just, well, whatever. There are interesting things about lattice theory, just as a mathematician, where you don't even need to think about logic.
Uh-huh.
And also, yeah, I guess to give some context, Rustan was suggesting we talk about something specific, which we haven't yet gotten to, and that does also involve lattices in some sense.
Yes, it does. Right.
Yeah, so
I'm
yeah.
happy to go there now if we want to dip into maybe some deeper technical things, or we can go
Um,
somewhere else if
uh,
you'd like.
I um I do, but let me think for just a second.
Mhm.
I also felt like you were going to maybe make a larger point about proving soundness of program logics,
Ah,
and I'm not sure. You can tell me I already made that point, or you can try and
uh,
summarize.
um, I was thinking that I had made a point, but actually, but then if it didn't come through, let me repeat or maybe expand on what I said somehow. So there are different ways of writing. As, if we agree, we what we want in the end is we want a sound program verifier. Um, so the way that that often is done then is you start with some source language like Java or C or something, and then you define a semantics, and that semantics is, as I said, typically written using sort of inference rules. And oh, this will be interesting for our conversation later about the extreme predicates. But those inference rules uh, are encoded often as inductive predicates in the least predicates,
Sure,
which
sure,
we
sure.
may then talk about in a bit.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, how else would you do it really, right? It's based, the core of logic is sort of
mhm.
here are the facts that are true without any assumptions, and then from there you can get more and more facts, and because we're finite beings, that's all we can do, right?
That's right.
Reasoning.
So, but now if someone has provided that already for an intermediate language, let's just call it Boogie to have some name, but it could be any kind of intermediate representation. If someone has already done that for at the Boogie level, then what you could do is we could, for if we build a checker on top of a verifier on top of a Boogie, then our thinking, what's going through our heads is not those inference rules likely, but instead we think of the translation into Boogie. That is, how are we going to encode these things? And however I do that, if I can, for each one of those rules, if I can show you my rules and you say, yes, this is the Java source language that we're trying to verify, then everything is good. And in fact, then we're done. But maybe you would say, well, this looks like the rules of, I mean, this is almost Java, except what are these assumptions that you have here and there? Um, that is, so without the assumptions, I think we could look at it and say, there's no need for a further soundness proof. I mean, if you want to do a soundness proof, you have to have some semantics and you need to have some translation that you shows lives up to that semantics.
Right, right. And you're saying
But
those two coincide in this case.
exactly. They could coincide. And if they coincide, I mean, actually, that's really the best kind of proof. I mean, then we have one representation and it's just sort of obviously correct. But in this case, it isn't quite obviously correct because, well, maybe for several reasons. Maybe the encoding is complicated for other reasons. But at least one reason that it's not obviously correct is that you're probably going to have some assumed statements in there. So what I'm saying as one way that one can or could, I mean, build a program verifier that is sound is to build it around a transpilation into a simpler language and that someone else takes care of the soundness of. And now we just need to justify the rules, the translation itself. And if that's simple enough, we're done. If it includes assumes or some other things, then we need to do some proofs. But if we could just prove that all of the assume statements that are being used there are justified in some way, then I think we would have gone a long way towards proving soundness. And I think that's going to be, I would think, much easier than to prove the soundness of a whole verifier for a whole language.
I see. I guess it's not so how would one go about doing that, right? You need a second translation to Boogie that has no assumes at all, and then somehow you prove
Maybe, right. I think
the
it would be, let's call it a meta boogie. So what the meta boogie program would then do is it would contain the boogie program that has some assumes in it. And then, but for every one of those assumes, the meta boogie would now have a lemma, and that lemma or a lemma or some kind of justification for every one of those assumes.
I see. Okay.
Which could be, for example, it could say, well, we know that at all call sites of a particular procedure or function or method, at all call sites, we know that the type checker has already checked that the variables are, let's say, 32-bit integers or whatever. And then you can assume it on the other side.
I see. So that's almost an axiom of
That's
what
right.
the operational semantics of Java would be.
That's right, exactly. And indeed, an axiom, exactly like an assume, you're going to have to justify as well. I mean, why? I mean, if you
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
Sure.
and usually axioms like that are hold because of something that holds at every step of the program execution. Not always. There could be other things that just talk about
Yeah.
mathematical things, but if they are, so if we could, so right, I really should include in my list of, that is one way that you could build, that you could prove the soundness of a program verifier is that the translation is simple enough that you can understand it, but there are some things that you have to check, that you check the assumes, and I should have said from the beginning also any kind of axiom that you have. And and those perhaps could be done in a meta proof, and they're probably more difficult proofs, or they could, maybe they're not more difficult. Maybe in
But
10 years we'll do them all
but
the time.
yeah, but that at the end of the day, somebody has to specify the very core operational semantics
Yeah,
of, or like what it means to be a well-formed Java program, and then what it means for that Java program to correctly execute.
right.
Um,
And the human has to agree on that, because
right.
Java is a language design. I mean, it is something
Yeah,
that like a computer couldn't possibly know what it would be unless we say what it is. And in my mind, maybe because I have sort of programmer's mindset in that sense, I find it easier, well, in many cases at least, to look at such a transpilation and say that it's correct, rather than looking at like an inference rules. And but that may, I mean, I mean, your mileage may vary depending on, I mean,
yeah.
but
I don't know that I have a good, strong opinion on this. I
right.
do.
But at least we should, I mean, it would be, I mean, one could say that, well, at least this is another way of achieving the goal. Maybe if people don't want to do it that way, that's
Sure,
okay.
sure,
But
sure, sure.
it's doing it through, there's not just one way of achieving soundness.
I have an unrelated question that occurs to me.
Mhm.
I wonder if it'll take us too far afield, but
Okay.
I also figure that since I have you here, that I have my captive audience, uh, maybe I should ask that question. And maybe I've already asked it to you kind of informally.
Mhm.
Um, but there's something, let's see. So program logics. So how do those work? I mean, I feel like the the current nowadays when you're talking about program logics is you want to present the programmer with this opportunity to specify what their program does.
Mhm.
And to do that, I mean, yeah, we're talking about operational semantics, right? And in some ways, this is a little bit of a circular problem, right? If the programmer only understands the operational semantics of their language, then the only thing they have available to even specify what the program should do
Mhm.
is the language itself, right? Which seems a little circular. Like
Oh, mhm.
I've noted that I think Linux kernel developers are very anti-comments, right? Which seems crazy to me. Like I love comments in code. I think everybody should write comments all the time, but there is a logic to it, which
Mhm.
is there is no way for the English language to say things more precisely than just the code itself. That is the code itself is the ultimate, arbiter of what the semantics of some given C function is.
Mhm.
And so to the Linux developers, they they don't want you to try to use anything else than actual C code to specify, what something is. And then
Hmm.
since you've written the C code anyway, well, that's just going to compile and run.
Hmm.
And so there's a tension here. And I feel like maybe I'm confusing my own point, but I feel like when you describe a program logic, you kind of want the programmer to write, let's say it's Java for the sake of argument. You
Hmm.
kind of want the programmer to write a piece of Java code that is the specification, and then also a piece of Java code that is the implementation. And then somehow y- at some point you might wonder why you need to write the code twice, right?
Hmm.
And in my mind, um, the Java code that is the specification needs to be simpler in some sense. And also, in my opinion, but as I say this out loud, I'm perhaps changing my mind.
Hmm.
I like that piece of specification code to be pure in some sense, to be effect free, because I
Hmm.
understand what it means, to be a mathematical function and to have a mathematical value. Whereas if something has side effects, then it feels very contingent on the state of all the other things. And
Right.
so what gives, I guess?
Hmm.
What in a program logic design,
Hmm.
what what should the specification be, if not just the body of the thing you're implementing?
Right. Right. So even in a functional program, one could talk about that there's some state of the program. And in a functional program, this state that you have never changes, but it sort of is extended with, I mean, ever more things. And But so therefore, I mean, program logic needs to have some way to be able to talk about the state. And and I think that even for an imperative program where things could get mutated, it's important to be able to describe one state. That is, you pause the computer at that time, and you want to be able to say what holds in this state. Or maybe in such a situation, you want to compare the state to another state because maybe some variable has a larger value in one state than another. So program logic needs to be able to talk about the state um, of the program. And then if you're going to describe that, there are a lot of operations that you're going to describe that I think it's to the benefit of the tool designer to make these specifications to be as similar as possible to the program. So if so, this is a mistake that I think we made in the extended static checker for module 3. Funny, now I'm referring, I mean, second time in this conversation about this 30-year-old tool that, I mean, which was great at the time, of course. But
Yeah,
one thing that we did at that point was we said that, well, if you have a field of an object, uh, you can think of the field as being itself. I mean, usually we think of an object as having, it's kind of like an object is kind of like a map from the field names to values. But you could turn I mean, your world to tilt it on its side to say, well, a field name is really a map from object references to values. So now the way that you're kind of slicing the program is, I mean, you can think of it as, suppose you think of the world, the memory as a two-dimensional heap. In one dimension, you sort of index it by the addresses, by the references, object by the pointers. And in the other direction, you're indexing by the name of the fields. Well, if we're now going to slice this up to variables, we could do it in different ways. You could either have maps from field names to values, then that's sort of an object, or you could say that it's that for every field, that's the like the real variable, and it's itself is a map from pointers to values. So the programming view is, I mean, is the former one. That is that objects, I mean, you want to think of an object as being a thing with fields in it. I mean, that's true for
yeah.
just about every programming language.
Sure, 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 sure.
Um, but you could
Every object-oriented programming. Well, maybe more than
even yeah,
object-oriented.
even C, I mean, C program or even functional programs, you have records, right, and things. So
Sure.
um, uh, but but mathematically, you have the option of encoding it in the other way. And in fact, like the Viper tool does that, Peter Muller and his group at ETH Zurich are producing, and they have many different verifiers built on top of Viper. And in Viper, which is also an intermediate verification language like Boogie, but it does things differently. There it has those fields essentially. But going back to, so that's the underlying mathematics. So, but we were talking about now, I mean, what do you want in the program logic? Well, so a mistake that I think that we made in in ESC in the extended static checker for module 3 was that we pushed the idea that when you have specification variables, they would be like a field. So you would write, instead of writing O.F for an object O and the field F, you would write F square brackets O. And we thought this was really the way to go, because this was really what the mathematics underneath was really all
I see.
about. And in retrospect, I think it was just a mistake. That is, it made the tool harder to use. And whoever, I mean, if you're used to Module 3 or Java or whatever the source language is, you don't want a different notation all of a sudden
Right, right.
to say essentially the same thing. So, so yeah, so how does one design a program logic? I think, I mean, at its core, it's going to talk about states. And I think that if as much as possible, I mean, that one should, as much as possible, um, try to keep the syntax and the feel of the programming language.
I see.
Just
But
for,
it is not the programming language,
not
crucially.
necessarily, right? Yeah. So
Okay.
at least, I mean, you're going to need additional things. For example, if it's an imperative program, you're going to sooner or later going to need something that compares a pre and post state, or maybe some other state. So you need some form of like old
Yeah, some
expressions,
temporal
or right, some
operation.
temper, exactly, right. Indeed, if you have, maybe the program checker is actually one that is going to check uh, temporal properties. Like in that case, those are probably not operators of the programming language. They're things
Yes,
lying on
it
top.
is.
Maybe you have some form of reachability in the specification language. Maybe, and maybe that's defined in terms of functions of the language, but maybe not. Maybe that's something you add to it.
Yes, 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 yes.
And another thing that's quite, I mean, popular in a number of program logics are those based on separation logic. So in separation logic, you have not just the normal conjunction, but you can essentially you can have different parts of the world, different chunks or heaplets or however you want to
Hmm.
think of it as, and they are separated. So really, when you write such a formula, you're writing, it looks like you're writing a formula about you're like splitting up the world, and then you have some local predicate for each one of them. Um, and that's probably also not something that's directly in the programming language. Well, or maybe it is. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it is.
Yeah, okay, that's an intriguing thought.
Right, right. So I think so, but as much as possible, if I could stick with the programming language, I think that's a good idea. I mean, just it keeps things simpler. I mean, in the end, I mean, even as scientists and mathematicians, whatever, I mean, we like to tinker, I mean, on our own things, but really, I mean, we want users, we want it to be used in some sort of way. And if we're building a tool for it, then just having something that looks good,
I
and it
see, I
looks
see, I see.
familiar is, I think it's a good idea.
Okay, okay. So, great. I think these are great points. I'll have to think about what I was trying to think about when I asked this question.
Okay, I see. Okay, did I go the wrong
I
direction maybe?
think, yeah, so what scares me sometimes is that if yeah, your specification language has to be math, right?
Mhm.
At its core.
Mhm.
So you might want the syntax of your object language, but you don't really want the semantics of your object language. You don't want to be able to increment a variable.
Ah, right. Oh, yes, actually, right. That I think is also an interesting point to discuss indeed. Right. So, and I was also going to say, I mean, you might also have things like quantifiers, like for all something, and then you could debate, is that something that's executable or not?
Right,
So
right.
here, actually, in different tools and languages that I've worked on, I've made different decisions. And So in the spec sharp language, which was a superset of C sharp that I did with Wolfram Schulte and Mike Barnett and some other colleagues, the there we decided that we wanted runtime checking and static verification. And so we built a static verifier, and things that we put into the language had runtime checks. And the reason for that was we wanted whoever would use this, we wanted to lure people into the
Yes.
language, to draw
Yeah.
them into writing something that would give them immediate benefit. And you get immediate benefit from
Yeah.
runtime
Powerful
checkable.
assertion language.
Right, yeah. That is, as long as you have all your programs, you can actually compile it and run it. But assuming that, um, but this has made a number of things difficult because uh, there's some, let's say quantifiers in particular. Some quantifiers are easy to deal with mathematically. You quantify over all of the integers and you say something, right? But you don't want to execute that. I mean, that would be an infinite, unbounded sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some other things are just the other way around. If you write something that sort of looks like a quantifier, but it iterates over some data structures, you get all of the values in a tree or something like that. Well, that's easy to understand at runtime because you just think it collects those values, it gives you one at a time. But dealing with it in the static verifier is more difficult because it's not going to iterate over things in the same way. You need some way to express it. So in spec sharp, there was a tension between static and dynamic checking, and it meant that we couldn't really fully do both. We couldn't fully do either. Um, but there were reasons for trying to do it that way. Then in ESE Java, which also so ESE Java when we started that, we had our own specification language for ESE Java. And it looked more like actual Java than
I see. I
ESE
see.
did for. But at that point, Gary Levins had started designing the Java modeling language, JML, which still exists today. And around that time, like late 90s, I would say, kind of there were a number of different. If you read papers at that time, everyone kind of rolled their own notation for um, for specifying Java programs. And I think, what Gary was able to do was he was able to round up everyone to sort of come on to the JML bandwagon. And this really helped both tooling and understanding papers and so forth. We had a common notation. So so we tried to merge ESE Java's annotation language and JML at around that time. And yeah, we were successful in some ways, in some other ways, maybe not. Um, but in any case, having that was good. But one tension that exists if you start with the programming, if you want to have a programming logic for an existing language like Java, and let's say Java in particular, um, there are so many places there where in such a language you have side effects, and like even just you concatenate two strings in Java, and if you do that twice, well, you're going to get two different results because underneath it's going to allocate a new object that represents that string. And the Java language, in such a perverted way, gives you access to that
Yeah,
pointer
yeah,
to the
yeah. It
string.
gives you
Right?
can peek under the curtain and see strange side effects of things that.
Yeah, and you get two different pointers. And actually, I remember when I first learned about Java in probably around 1995, something like that, 96 maybe, something like that. I thought it was beautiful because it was just objects and things were simple. But then when you build a verifier for it,
Yeah, you
or other
see.
things, it's not so nice. So
I mean, maybe that's, conceptually nice, right? But strings, you don't want them to be objects,
no,
really,
right.
right?
And there are many other things that you don't in the same way. And in Java, everything had to be encoded that way, which also meant that now if you write specifications in Java and in the program logic, then you almost have no choice. There are going to be side effects, and that's terrible because you don't want if you just want to evaluate a state predicate somehow in mathematics, you don't want it to change things
Yeah.
Or even if you have it at runtime, it's terrible too, because then if you run it with assertion checking or if you do static
Yeah,
verification
yeah,
with
yeah,
X,
yeah.
how
It
do you
has
know it's
different
really the
semantics.
program? Yeah. So therefore, in JML, there were, and other similar efforts as well, but there was a lot of this went on in JML at the time. There were notions of like you have a pure method because they're methods, and then are they deterministic and are they functions, and then you try to steer away from side effects, and then you can't use the Java library because they're all. I mean, it gets to be really complicated. So there in Dafny, so Dafny, I mean, is a programming language. And it's a programming language that was designed for verification, I mean, from the get-go. And in fact, I mean, to begin with, it was just going to be a little sort of, well, science project. I mean, an experiment to, I mean, a little tool for me to play around with. And then it kind of grew and got really good. But something that happened there is that Daphne really splits objects, that is, I mean, instances of classes and arrays and things. That's really separate from inductive data types. So in Dafny, and sequences are built in and stuff. So the language knows that there are value types that have no, I mean, you cannot mutate them. And in some ways, this came about a little bit by accident, I would think. But in retrospect, I think it's such a good idea I mean, that's what you want for the programming logic. So if you have that in the programming logic, then you can talk about all of those immutable things.
Right.
You can
And
talk about the current state of objects, but the specification itself cannot call out to something that's going to have to compute something and change the state
right.
and
So
you
the,
know.
so in some sense, two phases, right? There's this sort of
Yeah.
static phase,
Hmm.
and it's
Right.
funny, Lean actually, I don't want to talk about Lean that much, but Lean just introduced this biphase
Hmm.
system for different reasons, but it's
Hmm.
kind of funny that that this is
Yeah,
kind
no,
of a
definitely.
natural progression in
Right. Yeah.
specification languages where you sort of want things to happen statically and then things to happen dynamically, and then somehow um, you have only one direction in some
Hmm.
sense.
Right. Yeah, I would think, I mean, would, I mean, catch up in those ways for like proving programs. And I think in other systems, I mean, you talk about like logical variables and like in the Y3 system, you have such things. And I mean, in Dafny, you also have ghost variables that are, so ghosts are things that are not going to be compiled, but they, as much as possible, look just like the rest of the program. In fact, in
Right,
I
they
think
could be
just about every
compiled
one.
if they wanted to.
That's right. Yeah,
Almost.
most almost. Yeah, that's right. Except for like unbounded quantifiers and things like that. And but yeah, but it looks like you get the feeling that you understand it as if it were kind of compiled.
I
So
see.
yeah, so I think that there are many things that go into the programming logic, but certainly, yeah, having no side effects, I think that's, I mean, I would say it's a must. And that means that if you do it for a programming language with side effects, you have to restrict them in some way, and that just gets really painful. But I mean, you have to do it, and um, and and otherwise, sticking as much as possible. I mean, or where possible, sticking with the notation of the underlying
I
language
see.
is a good idea.
I mean, things that are painful, but you have to do it, feel like research opportunities,
Yeah,
right? Like
absolutely. That's true. Yeah, right. Yes, indeed.
maybe I'm becoming American by spinning
I
things as opportunities.
see. Yeah,
Um,
right, yeah.
okay, I don't know. If you want, we can talk about what we originally wanted to talk
Yeah,
about.
let's do that. Right. Yeah, right.
For again, for as long as you want. We have been at this for how long? A little over an hour and a half.
Oh, really?
Um,
Okay. Yeah. So maybe we
yeah,
should
I know it flies.
keep the other things shorter. But yeah.
No, this is delightful, and I guess I'll decide whether I upload it all at once or if I chunk it into more bite-sized pieces.
Great. Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, okay. So we talked about inductive predicates.
Mhm.
I basically said they're unavoidable if you want to specify a,